at the World Health Organization. They call the shots about the standards of global health and pandemic relief. China is now the preferred economic development partner for many nations. China is now the dominant force in standard-setting boards for global commerce. This is a choice the Trump administration is making to make China, and to a certain extent Russia in certain forums, the dominant power when it comes to economic statecraft, information statecraft, energy statecraft. Let me give you a specific example. Today, information is power. If you control information flows, man, you control politics, you control economics, you control culture. China spends about $7 billion a year to promote their communist narrative, to undermine U.S. leadership around the world and foster a China-friendly media environment globally. Russia, it's really hard to know how much Russia spends because they're not publicly reporting much of it, but they certainly spend at least $1.5 billion, but probably double that. And in many countries, Russia and China just control the information space. Russian-backed candidates win elections in countries on their periphery simply because of Russian information programs. Asian countries box the United States and U.S. companies out of economic competition because of Chinese information programs. And so, faced with China and Russia spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 billion, when the United States today is spending only a fraction of that amount of money, it would stand to reason that this would be a moment where we should come together, Republicans and Democrats, and dramatically increase our information warfare investments. But of course, we're doing exactly the opposite. Trump is in the middle of a purposeful, relentless campaign to destroy America's global information power. The Trump administration just shut down the Global Engagement Center. That is the capacity at the State Department to try to counter Russian and Chinese propaganda around the world. Gone, just gone. Global Engagement Center, bipartisan commitment, set up years ago by myself and Rob Portman, supported by Marco Rubio when he was a senator, now just doesn't exist any longer. The administration is dismantling the U.S. Agency for Global Media. That's the umbrella arm that oversees our information programs around the world. They laid off 92% of its staff. Voice of America, the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, they are on track to disappear. The arm of the VOA that combats Iranian anti-American information, gone. 54 different radio frequencies operated by Radio Free Asia to counter Chinese anti-American propaganda, gone. At the same time, China is opening up 80 new radio frequencies in multiple languages, including in those regions where America is disappearing. We are handing the world to China and Russia by deciding to view American power only through a military lens. And this rescissions bill makes it worse by enacting billions of dollars of cuts to diplomacy, to economic development programs, likely to information programs, because we actually can't see the impact of all of these cuts. It's all surrender. China is throwing a blowout party as we disappear our non-military power from the world. Trump terminated tens of millions of dollars in projects to upgrade Africa's power grid. What did China do? They announced $50 billion of new financing for Africa. Africa, a place where the critical minerals exist to power AI and future defense systems. Africa, the part of the world whose economy is going to explode with opportunity, now opportunity that will go to Chinese companies, not American companies, as we withdraw our relationships with that continent as China steps into the breach. This revisions bill, standing next to Trump's destruction of all of our non-military foreign policy tools, is surrender to our enemies. This bill is a double cross. It is. It's a double cross. It's going to harm our ability to ever be able to do a bipartisan budget process in the future. But even worse, this bill is surrender to our adversaries who are chomping at the bit to fill the void that we are creating by adopting the national security strategy of an 8-year-old boy.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, it was just a few weeks ago right here on this Senate floor that our Republican colleagues on a straight party line vote cut millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars back from investments in healthcare like Medicaid. And as a result, millions and millions of Americans are going to lose access to healthcare. And for what? All for a giant giveaway, tax giveaway that disproportionately benefits the very wealthiest in America. They called it the Big Beautiful Bill. It was beautiful if you're a billionaire. For everybody else, it came at your expense in one form or another. Now, here today on the floor of the Senate, we have Republicans bringing a partisan bill once again. This time to cut $9 billion in important investments, including from public radio and public television. And as my colleague Senator Murphy just indicated, from very important foreign assistance programs that are essential to American diplomacy and ultimately to American power and interests around the world. This is not America first. This is America in retreat, or President Trump surrendering. So, to add insult to injury, these cuts are coming after Republicans in this very body and the House of Representatives passed and President Trump signed into law provisions that included the very programs that we're talking about cutting today. In other words, this is a total switcheroo where one day Republicans vote for a package that includes essential investments, and the next day they turn around on a party line vote and erase the investments that were just signed into law. That will undermine the entire appropriations process. Now, I've been listening to comments from some of my Republican colleagues, and they say this is about reducing the national debt. Well, I am all for reducing our deficits and our debt. But I ask my Republican colleagues, if you really cared about fiscal responsibility and deficits in the debt, what happened 2 weeks ago on the floor of the Senate? Because Republican senators pulled all-nighters in order to pass legislation that resulted in the largest debt increase in American history, throwing away trillions of dollars to in part pay for tax cuts for billionaires. That bill that passed the Senate just 2 weeks ago will add $4 trillion to our national debt. Why is that? Because even after they made cuts to Medicaid, which will throw millions of Americans off their health care, even after that, the tax cuts that disproportionately benefit wealthy people were so big that it's still going to explode the deficit by $4 trillion. And now here they come 2 weeks later to pass this rescissions bill that cuts very important services and very important components of our foreign policy for $9 billion. Mr. President, that is 0.23 of 1% of the debt that the Republican senators voted to increase just 2 weeks ago. So nobody's fooling anybody when senators come down to the floor and say, we got to do this because of our national debt, having exploded the national debt by $4 trillion just 2 weeks ago. And so what does this package include? Well, it includes cuts to public radio. That includes NPR, includes PBS, also public television is cut. So we explode the debt by $4 trillion 2 weeks ago, and this week we're coming after Big Bird. That is their solution to dealing with the national debt. If you look at the cuts to public radio, they can have very harmful impacts around the country. Because in many rural areas especially, people do use access to public radio to get alerts about natural disasters. So this would put those communities at risk, and this is part of a pattern. It's part of a pattern we're seeing in the funds being withheld by this Trump White House that we've already passed. Here we're talking about cutting funds through this partisan process, but the Trump White House is also unilaterally withholding important funds for disaster relief. We learned after the tragic flooding in Texas that claimed so many lives that FEMA failed to answer nearly 2/3 of the calls on its disaster assistance line because the Trump administration had cut so much of the FEMA staff. In my state of Maryland, a number of months ago, we witnessed terrible flooding in the western part of our state. In fact, some of you may have seen the images of elementary school students being evacuated from their school on boats. Fortunately, no one died in that flood, but the damage was extensive. And we're still waiting on the Trump administration to answer our state request for some help for those families and small businesses that were hit. Now, this is a pattern that goes beyond just disaster relief. In Maryland, we've also seen cuts to FEMA programs designed to protect communities and let them have the resources to put in place protections like higher walls so that they are not victims of natural disasters. Those funds were cut. So we see those cuts to those essential programs. We're also seeing this across the board when it comes to global health. And I'm not going to go through all of those cuts. Some of my colleagues have identified those. I will just say that our foreign assistance is not charity. Our foreign assistance, as colleagues have said, has been an essential element of our overall foreign policy. And if you talk to wise generals at the Defense Department, they will tell you that our national security and foreign policy strategy rests on 3 pillars. Yes, of course, defense and military power, but also diplomacy and development. And when you make these deep cuts that are impacting diplomacy and development, including, by the way, the 1,300 patriotic State Department employees who were just fired last week, when you do that, it's our adversaries who benefit, and it's the American people who lose, along with our allies. Because those are not giveaways, those investments. You know, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't just sit in your house and let your neighbor's house burn. You go help them out because they're your neighbor and it's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do because that fire may be heading to your house next. And when it comes to issues like global health and the spread of disease around the world, it's the same story. We save millions of lives, including millions of kids' lives, when we help, but we also prevent those diseases from jumping over the oceans and coming to hurt people right here in the United States of America. But this administration doesn't care. If you look at a Lancet study, they've estimated that the cuts that the Trump administration is made in the area of global health and other important investments will cost 14 million lives by the year 2030, including 4.5 million children who will die. We just saw a story in Atlantic that revealed that the Trump administration is paying to incinerate, to light on fire, 500 tons of emergency nutritional biscuits that could go to feed hungry kids. So, Mr. President, I really urge my colleagues to take a step back and not move forward with these cuts. As I said, the notion that this is somehow their contribution to reducing our national debt when they exploded our national debt by $4 trillion over 10 years just 2 weeks ago is ludicrous. But I will close, since I see the Vice Chair of the Appropriations Committee on the floor, with just a final point that does deserve repeating, which is we've had a bipartisan appropriations process. We've done our very best to preserve that tradition. But when you take an action on one day and we vote on a bipartisan basis for important American priorities, whether in public radio or addressing global health issues, when we do that one day and the President of the United States signs that into law, and then we run down here a few months later and said, you know what, we didn't mean it with respect to these programs, and we, on a partisan basis, are going to yank them away, that undermines trust and confidence in this entire system. So, both for the American people and the important investments that we did make and which they will now lose, but also for the future of this institution and the power of the purse, I urge my colleagues to vote against this bill. And I yield the floor.
Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the following senators be permitted to speak prior to votes: myself for up to 10 minutes, Senator Cantwell for up to 10 minutes, Senator Murray for 5 minutes, and Senator Schumer for 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Most of us who grew up in Bible-believing households know this is the shortest verse in all of Scripture, and in some ways, the most powerful. One that haunts me. Jesus wept in John the 11th chapter, 35th verse, because he had come too late, seemingly, to save the life of Lazarus. He wept because someone he knew and loved had died, and it had caused such harm and loss to his family. Today, we are doing something on this floor of this Senate. My Republican colleagues are doing something on the floor of this Senate that I believe would make Jesus weep. In Luke, there's a moment in the 10th chapter where a lawyer, and it's always a lawyer, comes to test Jesus. And trying to justify himself, presses Jesus with questions. What must I do to gain eternal life? And Jesus says, what does the Scripture teach? And he says, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. And the second commandment is like unto it, you should love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, you have read well. Do this and you will gain eternal life. But the lawyer, hoping to be justified, says, but wait, who is my neighbor? And what follows is the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan, where the righteous, the priestly, the respected, the powerful walk on the other side of the road when they encounter someone who's been set upon by robbers. Not my problem, not my neighbor. But in the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's this person, a Samaritan, from a disfavored ethnicity, someone outside the circle of concern to the ancient Israelites who does the right thing. This parable would have been shocking at the time that it was preached by Jesus. The idea that the good neighbor was the outcast, the unexpected, would be something that frankly would have been a surprise. So although today being a good Samaritan is a common term, it's important to know the history. We are taught as children that we are to see all as our neighbors, not just those who live next door, not just those who look like us or speak like us or pray like us, but the widest possible definition of neighbor is what we are called through righteousness to see in the world. And what a difference it has made. Because our nation has for decades embraced the cause of being present, of caring, of making life-saving differences to young mothers and children, to widows and orphans, to the imprisoned, to the hungry, to the refugee, to those fleeing oppression, to those seeking relief from authoritarian governments, for those seeking a better way. We are all God's children, and from childhood we are taught that the golden rule, which appears in virtually every religion, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is the very foundation of the goodness of America. That we care for each other as neighbors, and we care for the world as neighbors. Yes, we are the most charitable, giving, philanthropic, engaged nation on earth. And yet all that we do in foreign aid is 1%, less than 1% of our total federal budget. Months ago, when Elon Musk and Doge began roaming about the federal agencies of our government, their first target was that delivers disaster relief, that helps feed the hungry, that helps welcome the refugee, that helps stabilize countries going through turmoil. They laid off thousands, they shut down programs, they canceled billions. And yet here today, we are at it again. Republicans are proposing even deeper cuts. I want to talk about one area of the many that will be cut, I fear, later today. Disaster assistance. Our nation's been riveted as we've watched the tragedy that unfolded in the Texas Hill Country, where a raging river killed dozens and dozens of innocent children. And you know, around the world, when disaster strikes, it is the Americans who show up first. It is Americans who show up with relief, with assistance, with skill and talent and ability. It's been this way for decades, and it should be this way still. I was on a bipartisan trip to the Philippines just a few months ago with Senator Ricketts. And I was struck to learn that the Philippines, of all the nations on earth, is the most prone to natural disasters. They value our partnership, our alliance. We've been security partners for decades. There's many Filipino Americans. There's a close and deep relationship. But in meeting with their national leaders, their elected leaders, their senators and their ministers of their cabinet, they said, you know, it makes an incredible difference here in the Philippines. Every time there's a typhoon, there's an earthquake, there's a volcano, it's the Americans who come. It's the Americans who deliver the aid, who help us help ourselves with training and equipment and support. And you know, in the excess of Doge's deep cuts, they fired and laid off most of our experts who are capable of delivering world-class disaster relief. We saw the consequences with an earthquake in Myanmar just 3 months ago, where the few remaining folks who did this work were laid off as they were deployed. And instead, the response was led by the Chinese. We are driving nations into the open arms of our adversaries. We have long been known as a nation that sought to be respected, admired, believed in, embraced, not for the example of our power, but by the power of our example. That when there were dread pandemics killing millions, America showed up. One of the positives of this day is that my Republican colleagues have recoiled from fully shutting down PEPFAR, and that is a positive. One of the best things we've ever done as a nation is to save 27 million lives across the world that otherwise would have been lost to HIV/AIDS. But I'll tell you, when Ebola raged across Africa in 2014, I was the one member of Congress who went to Liberia. At the request of the president, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a brave and proud leader of a nation struggling, facing massive losses of life. Projections at the early stages of the Ebola pandemic were that a fifth to a quarter of their population would die in a matter of weeks. And who came to help? The Americans. Catholic Relief Services, Save the Children, CARE, the U.S. military, our public health service. I'll never forget meeting a young Liberian named Alvin. He dropped out of college to become a physician's assistant to help when the outbreak began, and he, in caring for patients himself, contracted Ebola, a near certain death sentence. Yet Alvin was evacuated by Americans to the Ebola treatment center set up and funded and equipped by Americans, and his life was saved by Americans. Whether it was the president of the nation, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, or Alvin, the folks I met on that trip to Liberia thanked and praised the American people for our decency, our kindness, our seeing them as our neighbor in their moment of deepest struggle, risk, and loss. And yet today, my colleagues would rather trim 0.1% of the budget, $9 billion, to cut deeper into food aid and disaster assistance and fighting pandemics, all to justify a tax cut. I can think of few more despicable acts on this floor in my 15 years. I can speak to process. We have a bipartisan appropriations process where we can and should debate and consider these further cuts and put them on the floor and vote them up. But this is an odd thing. It's a rescission. It's a cutting back further of money we've already appropriated. Just a few minutes later today, I will be trying to get votes to end $465 million of further cuts in disaster assistance that'll be on the floor today. Taking money from the World Food Program and UNICEF, from Red Cross and Save the Children, from Catholic Relief Services and World Vision. Folks may think at home that this money that goes out to the world is money better spent here. But for the pennies on the federal dollar that we spend responding to disasters around the world, organizations we all know and a majority of us believe in and support, like the Red Cross, World Vision, or Catholic Relief Services, are able to appear in time and deliver life-saving aid. Think about what we are doing. Think about the example we are setting. Think about what we are teaching our children. Open your hearts and eyes and realize what we are about to do. This is a nation of which I am so proud. And yet at times it does things of which I am so ashamed. I cannot imagine the faces in the refugee camps, in the villages, in the clinics, in the schools, in the towns, in the cities around the world, who for years have been used to the idea that when there's a pandemic, the Americans come. That when there's an earthquake, the Americans come. That when there is starvation, the Americans come. Today we will vote, no, we won't. We are more interested in ourselves and in a bigger tax cut than we are in saving starving children. People laid low by the devastation of an earthquake. Families separated by a typhoon. The best part of this nation, what truly makes us great, is our selfless giving to others. We will be judged by how we act today. For God's justice is swift and sure. And I tremble when I think about the answer this chamber will give today to the question, who is my neighbor? Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, we should turn aside. We should not, with this act and this vote today, make Jesus weep. Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we are about to vote on this package, but I wanted to first make sure my colleagues understood that we are not just voting on whether local news stations shut down, or whether communities can get information in an emergency, or whether or not America